The supply curve shows the relationship between the price of bread and the quantity of bread that a seller is willing and able to offer for sale, holding constant other factors that influence supply, such as the price of inputs, technology, and expectations about future prices. What happens to the supply curve if we change some of those other variables? Of course, the supply curve shifts. In this lesson, we'll be looking at a particular case of a shift in the supply curve. Then, in the next lesson, we'll be looking at a catalog of all of the factors that can shift the supply curve. So let's start with a specific example. Remember, we're talking about a particular baker who has this relationship between price and quantity. This is the supply schedule that we used in the last lesson. Suppose now that we allow a change in one of the factors that we held constant when we wrote down this schedule. Suppose in particular that we allow the price of inputs to increase. An increase in the price of milk and eggs and other inputs used to produce bread is going to influence the profitability of this bakery. In particular, with higher input prices, it's going to be less profitable to make bread, and the response of the baker will be to scale back his operation. With the higher prices for inputs, we will see a smaller quantity of bread supplied at every price. So we can put these numbers in the table to represent the quantity supplied after the change in input prices. And as before, I'm putting a little apostrophe after the S, a symbol we usually call prime, to indicate S prime is a new supply schedule after the change in input prices. So with the higher prices of inputs, this baker is unwilling to offer any bread for sale at a price of 40 cents per loaf. We get the first loaf of bread on sale at a price of 60 cents per loaf. 2 loaves offered at $1 per loaf, 3 loaves at $1.50 per loaf, 3.5 loaves per week sold at a price of $2.10 per loaf, and so forth. Notice that we have a smaller quantity supplied than before at every price. A change in one of the variables that we previously held constant required us to redraw the entire supply schedule. Now, I'll move this information over to the board and we'll represent this change in supply as a shift in the supply curve that we drew. Here I go, moving the information to the board. And I will go back to the diagram that we were looking at before. With a change in input prices, with an increase in the price of milk and eggs and other factors that go into producing bread, we're going to get a change in the supplier's behavior. Let me simply graph the numbers from the table over on the board. At a price of 40 cents now, we have 0 loaves of bread offered for sale. So the new dot for the new supply curve will be over at a quantity of 0 at a price of 40 cents. So it shifts over to the axis itself. At a price of 60 cents per loaf, we now get 1 loaf of bread offered for sale per week. So here's a point on the new supply curve at 60 cents per loaf and 1 loaf per week. At a price of $1 per loaf now, we get 2 loaves of bread for sale. So here's another point on the new supply curve. The price is $1 and the quantity that the baker is willing and able to sell is 2 loaves. Another point is 3 loaves offered for sale at a price of $1.50 per loaf. So here's a point on the new supply curve. We get 3.5 loaves offered for sale at a price of $2.10 per loaf. So here's another point. Price $2.10, quantity 3.5 loaves. We get 4 loaves for this particular baker when the price is up to $2.50 per week. So that's going to be this point. 4 loaves, $2.50. We get 5 loaves at a price of $3 per loaf. That's going to be this point in the diagram. And 6 loaves at a price of $4 per loaf. That will be this point in the diagram. And finally, we get 6.5 loaves at a price of $5 per loaf. So that's going to be this point up here on the diagram. $5 on the vertical axis and 6.5 loaves on the horizontal axis. I'm trying to be careful here, make sure that my numbers line up. 5 and 6.5. Now I can connect these dots because all the prices and quantities in between are imaginable, and I'll label my new curve S prime It's a new relationship between price and quantity for this baker after the price of inputs increases. So the supply curve has shifted inwards. The increase in the price of inputs made bread a less profitable business and resulted in our supplier offering a smaller quantity of bread for sale at every price. Now, let's go back and review something that we talked about when we introduced the concept of shifts back in our study of the demand curve. If the price of bread changes, you move along your given supply curve. A change in the price of bread leads to a change in the quantity of bread supplied, and that's represented as a movement along a given supply curve. But if you change one of those variables that we hold constant when we draw the supply curve, then you have to shift the supply curve. The entire relationship between price and quantity changes for that baker because input prices have increased. We call this change in one of those variables and the shift in the supply curve a change in supply. A change in quantity supplied is a response to the price of bread changing, and that's a movement along the supply curve. But if you change one of those other factors, like the price of inputs, technology, and so forth, then you have to redraw the entire supply curve, and we call that a change in supply. In the next lesson, we'll go through an entire catalog of factors that can shift the supply curve. We will look at all of those things that can cause a change in supply. And I'll give you a chance to make some predictions about which way you think the supply curve will move in each case.